We're ecstatic to be co-sponsoring this event, which is being live streamed to many people around the country, on draining the swamp. The swamp being Washington, D.C. You may know, if you know your history, it is or was a literal swamp. And so it perhaps should be no surprise to us if we read de Tocqueville and other great writers about America that 225 years into building a bureaucracy, that it has become a figurative swamp as well. And so with our friends at the American Principles Project, it is a great pleasure to shed some light on that swamp being drained. I think I know most of you in the room, but if I don't, and for those of you joining us via live stream, I'm Kevin Roberts, Executive Vice President of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We are always pleased to play whatever role, small or big, we can in educating the public about the importance of limited government and the one purpose that government has, the single purpose, and that is to defend and promote the liberty of the citizens it serves, not the other way around. In fact, that is, if there is a litmus test question to be employed at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, that would be it. So if you're interested in ever working here, be sure to remember the answer to that question. How is that relevant to our topics today, whether it be this panel or what will undoubtedly be a wonderful speech by Attorney General Paxton, or the final panel today with former Congressman Tim Huelskamp? What's the connection between liberty and draining the swamp and deconstructing the administrative state? Well, over the last 60 or 70 years, one of the rotten fruits of the American left has been building this bureaucratic state in which unelected people make decisions that are our natural rights. And that our founders, when they established a democratic republic, intended to make decisions for us on our behalf with regular checkups called elections. That is precisely the problem. And I will save some of the data that I have for you in the panel that I will serve on this afternoon, but you ought to know that this is an egregious problem facing this republic. And you know, we're not alarmist here at the foundation. We're very much data-driven, facts-driven, but the facts and the data are very alarming. And I believe that the growth of the administrative state endangers the republic. And so in our first panel today, you're going to hear some of the leading minds speak about this, and also, as is always the case here at the foundation, not just highlight the problem, but talk about solutions, and I'm hopeful give us some next steps, some action items that we can take into playing a role in the solution. So it's my pleasure to say that we're very grateful to have with us the Executive Director of the American Principles Project, Terry Schilling. This whole day was Terry's idea, and so we at the foundation here in Austin are always privileged just to play the role of host, and we're very grateful for Terry's involvement here. Terry, take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Kevin. Like Kevin said, my name's Terry Schilling, and I'm very excited to be here. I joked with my cohorts yesterday that as soon as you land in Texas, you can just smell the freedom. We greatly admire your state, and we also greatly admire the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're very grateful for this opportunity to talk with all of you and present to you some of the issues that we've been working on and some of the things that we think are important. Listen, if you talk to any independent-minded voter, they're going to tell you, I don't know why I vote. No matter who I vote for, nothing changes. The government continues to grow. My life gets worse. My economic situation, the future looks bleaker. And the progressive creep continues. And there's a question there. Why is that? Democrats come and go, Republicans come and go, but it just continues to get more progressive and the government continues to get bigger. Bureaucrats gain more power, elected officials cave more often or are too weak to fight. And at the end of the day, it's our future that is hurt by this, and it's our citizens that are losing economic mobility and liberty. But what's the root cause of this? Are Americans actually rejecting the principles of our founding of human dignity and liberty and self-government and equality? Or is there something more nefarious going on? at the heart of this progressive takeover. Was this the system that our founders had intended for us? Or have we gotten off the path that they intended? Today we're going to be talking about all of this and how to turn things around. And I'm very excited because we've got a really great crew here, very credentialed, very experienced, and I think they all have incredible insights to bring to the table. First up, we have Dr. Tom Lindsay. Tom's the director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's Center for Higher Education. He recently published an American government college textbook called Investigating American Democracy with Gary Glenn. And Tom has also been involved with the National Endowment for the Humanities and was named deputy chairman and Chief Operating Officer in 2007. He received his BA, summa cum laude, in political science and went on to earn his MA and PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. We also have Erin Tuttle. Erin is a policy analyst at American Principles Project. She co-authored the book Deconstructing the Administrative State, The Fight for Liberty, along with Emmett McGroaty, who's also here, and Jane Robbins. Erin founded Hoosiers Against the Common Core and helped Indiana become the first state to pass legislation against the Common Core. Erin is a graduate of Indiana University. And last but certainly not least, we have Emmett McGroaty. He is a senior fellow at the American Principles Project. He co-authored the book along with Erin, Deconstructing the Administrative State, The Fight for Liberty. And Emmett has been working in public policy for more than a decade and has even helped spark, he even helped spark a national movement of parents and teachers against the Common Core across the country. Emmett is a graduate of Georgetown University and the Fordham School of Law. Before I get into my questions that I have for the panelists, I'd like to ask each one of them to kind of set the stage, give a little preview for what they're going to cover today. And so we'll start with Tom. Tom, can you give us a...
Sure, I'd be happy to. Good morning, everyone. I've been asked to talk about higher education, which is what I work on. Before I list the major effects of federal involvement in education, let me start by saying something you may all know, but I should say it anyway. Under the Constitution, the federal government has no role in education, be it K-12 or higher education. Even Chief Justice John Marshall, who is credited with implementing Hamilton's vision for a strong central government, even Marshall, in writing the Supreme Court opinions that justify a strong national government, says that in matters of health laws and morals and education, the states have sole prerogative. Sole prerogative. Nevertheless, as we know, the federal government has gotten deeply involved in both higher education and K-12. Let me just tell you some of the effects and then we'll go on. Today, tuition stands 440% higher than it was 25 years ago. That's 4 times the CPI over the same period. That's twice the rate of increases in health care costs over the same period. In order to pay for these massively and quickly rising tuitions, students and their families have taken on unprecedented student loan debt, which today stands at $1.4 trillion, the highest in history. It's higher even than total national credit card debt, and this in a country that's pretty addicted to credit cards. To get these degrees, students spend this money and go into this debt. Where do they end up afterward? At least a third of them end up underemployed with a college degree. Recent college graduates, a third are underemployed, meaning they either don't have a job or they have a job that they could have gotten with a high school degree in the first place. 1/2 of all the students who start a 4-year traditional college drop out. Part of the mantra that everyone who graduates high school should go to a 4-year college has produced a true disrespect for the hard work done by blue-collar workers. And as a result of which, today in Texas, the average age of a plumber is 58. Plumbers make a lot of money, and they don't spend all the money that you have to spend to get a 4-year degree. Studies show that 36% of all college students nationwide, after 4 years in college, show little to no increase in critical thinking, complex reasoning, or writing skills. It's as if they hadn't even been there. And despite the fact that they're learning so little, Grades today are higher than they've ever been. In the early 1960s, 15% of all college grades awarded nationwide were A's, 15%. Today, an A is the most common grade given in college. 45% of all grades are A's. 75% are A's or B's. Employers have been telling me for years, we barely look at transcripts. Everybody's got all A's and B's.
Yeah.
So, we, on the side of higher ed reform, look at this picture and we pronounce it a broken system. And the reason it's a broken system is because we violated the Constitution and allowed the federal government into what should have been wholly a state concern.
Thanks. Erin?
Oh,
Oh, Emmett? Sorry.
I echo what Terry said. It's always refreshing for a patriot to visit Texas. So I'm native Washingtonian. I was Washington, D.C. I grew up in the swamp. And it's interesting that when I grew up, Washington, D.C. was really just a series of small towns with a lot of working people. Now, and inside the Beltway, there were a lot of working farms. Now it's just a huge metropolis like LA, but it's all kind of devoted and geared toward sustaining and building the administrative state. So I think, though, that the American people realize that the constitutional system is severely damaged. It's not working the way it's supposed to. It's not working the way the framers intended. Increasingly, too, I think they're starting to realize that this dysfunction is affecting their fundamental liberties. And we'll get into that as this panel progresses. I think the most tangible manifestation of that is the election of President Trump on a populist wave. And that's what the president did when he was campaigning. He, more so than any other candidate, he talked to the American people with the media not there and asked them questions. And I think that was his debate prep, that was his issue prep. And he sensed that America had, that things were eroding. The great American experiment was in jeopardy. So he's appointed, some of his appointees have been good and have tried to implement his vision of returning government to the people. Some of them not so much. But in any event, much more is needed than executive orders and regulatory changes. That's for sure. I mean, multiple pieces of legislation are needed at the very least, and perhaps even constitutional amendments in addition to legislation. And so Erin and I and our colleague Jane Robbins have just finished this book and Deconstructing the Administrative State, The Fight for Liberty, and we've tried to drill down into this dysfunction. Why does it exist? Why does the administrative state keep growing and growing, as Terry said? It all, for the most part, it all goes back to a central question. Do you believe in the American experiment? About over 100 years ago, there arose a political philosophy that was of the view that the American experiment was a failure and had to be reworked. And that was the philosophy of progressivism. But so you contrast that with the American experiment. The American experiment, as you all know, was fashioned or rests on a central idea, and that's that we're all created equal by God and endowed with certain unalienable rights. And they created the constitutional structure to have a government that was consistent with that idea. And it was, as Kevin said, the purpose of that structure was to protect our liberties and ensure that government was citizen-directed. Both those things work together. The progressives, though, were of the view that there are no natural rights that can't be invaded by government. And they had a darker view of mankind. People needed to be managed. We need a managed economy, a managed society. And there's only a few creative people, which ironically they classified themselves as those creative people. And that these creative people would manage the rest of society. The progressives, though, looked at America, and there were two great hurdles to that. One was the constitutional structure. You can't have paramount rights that would run against or conflict with a managed society. You need to empower these experts to govern society and change society as they saw fit. And of course, the other was our citizen-directed government. We can't have citizen-directed government and expert-directed government. But they knew too, and you go back and you look at their writings and statements, and it's quite certain, they knew too that the American people had a passion. American people really believed in the American experiment. So they couldn't just abolish these things. So they came up with techniques. They came up with techniques, which Erin will get into, to circumvent the Constitution and to reshape the minds of the people. And so these techniques are used across government, in subject area to subject area. And I think this is really why progressives have been winning this war. And they have been winning step by step over 100 years. It's because conservatives, traditionalists, libertarians have been viewing these changes as discrete policy changes in discrete areas. So you may be interested in education policy, but not transportation policy. Someone else is interested in environmental policy, but not land use policy, and on and on. It's sort of a divide and conquer approach to governance. And so they're able to muster the elitist forces that have been really built up and strengthened by the administrative state, and drive these policy changes. But to them, though, those policy changes are only an intermediate step. They have a larger, more profound goal, and that profound goal, as I said, is to circumvent the constitutional structure and to change the minds of the American people. And they understand that. That's why they tend to be, in their fight, lockstep for progressivism. They fight all the issues. We don't. And I think this has to be the next step in the fight for liberty, is we have got to settle on looking at these techniques that are used by government. And that's part of the battle too. And once we do that, we'll realize that education policy and transportation policy, EPA policy, land use policy, public health, they're all connected. And as we show in our book, the progressives, the administrative state treats them as connected. And they're interlocking. And they're all pieces of a puzzle. The only people who don't treat them as interlocking are conservatives. So that's sort of the gist of the book.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of people, when they think about the administrative state, they know that it's a bad thing, but it's sort of this amorphous structure, and no one really knows what it is and how it works. And so I think what I'll do is just go through a few of those things quickly so we can just get on to the question part of the panel. The first one is something that you are all very well aware of, and that is federal grants that have policy considerations tied to them. Over the last several decades, it's become increasingly difficult, for, as Justice Roberts said, for states to act like states, because the percent of state revenues coming from federal grants has increased from like 12% in the 1960s to almost 30% today. So that's the first one. There's also a lot of federal research that's conducted, some of which is good research, but a lot of it is really biased policy argumentation devised to support a particular narrative, and I'll get into that, I think, a little later in the panel. There's also this idea that federal programs have a PR component. If you look at the number of federal employees that are public relations people, it makes the United States like the #1 public, or the largest public relations company in the world. So some of it is good, but a lot of it is designed to sort of guide the state legislature and governors, and in the end, the American people, to a particular policy conclusion. There's also the practice of the federal government jumping over the state and giving directs and different programs directly to the subsidiaries of the state, which is a practice that really originated from a desire to do an end round around state policy making, so that the federal government didn't have to deal with the states when they wanted something to be done at the city or county level. There are also some areas like transportation where the federal government actually requires the state or the local government to set up what we're calling ghost governments. And these are like parallel governing structures that operate outside the design of state government. An example of that would be like your metropolitan planning organizations. There's also, there's interagency grants. And this is where one department sort of colludes with multiple other federal departments in order to streamline the conditions of their grants and their technical assistance to drive a certain federal agenda. So when they say things like, we're going to leverage federal grants, we're going to streamline federal grants, what that really means is that what the clout of one agency or one department can't force the states to do, the clout of 3 or 4 departments certainly does. So that's the gist of the techniques. I think I'll just turn it back over to you.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, Emmett, you can, Tom, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to, I think that Emmett and Erin gave a very nice job showing them the destructive effects of the administrative state. So I just wanted to add, how did we get here? How did we get to the administrative state, given how bad its effects are? And, go back to Benjamin Franklin, who said, if a people trades its liberty for security, it'll end up with neither. Right? And then Alexis de Tocqueville, whom Kevin mentioned in his opening remarks, said this in Democracy in America. He foresaw the rise of the administrative state because he foresaw the eventuality of people trading their liberty for the promise of greater security. And Tocqueville said this 180 years ago about the effect of the administrative state. He said, such a power does not destroy, but it prevents things from coming into existence. It doesn't tyrannize, but it compresses, weakens, extinguishes, and stupefies a people until each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. I can't think of a more fitting description of where the American people are today and what the effect of the administrative state has been.
Yeah.
Well, I think that leads right into the first question that I had. So the title of this panel is called Restoring the Founders' Vision for America. And so I guess the first question that I have is, and I'll direct this to Emmett, what exactly was that vision? And you kind of briefly talked about it in your opening statement, but can you go more into that? What are our founders' vision for this country and for the states and for the federal government?
Well, the end of the day, what they really envisioned was what started the country. I mean, you started with the First Continental Congress, if you will, and that wasn't an elitist group. That was a group of people that had been sent by town halls and town meetings across the colonies. And the ideas bubbled up from the people, bubbled up from the churches and those meetings and the writings of countless citizens across the country. And that was really their idea of government, that it would bubble up, that it would be controlled by the people. And that was part of the reason for the compound republic, the system of dual sovereign governments. The more general government would be within the states, and they even foresaw the states would drive that down to local policy making. And I think that's the gist of it. You'd have a very active citizenry. That's all been turned on its head through these techniques that Erin was talking about. Now we just have sort of a farce of local government. You have local school boards, but very little education policy is really decided in the local school boards. It's really state and really much of it driven by the federal government. And surprise, surprise, it has a progressive bent. And it's a progressive bent that is dumbing down our children. That's the gist of progressive education. We're going to get away from academic content and move toward shaping children's minds to orient them toward a more collectivist society, to make them more receptive to rule by experts. That's why, you're all familiar probably with the agony of group projects in the schools. This is where this comes from. So it's really, everything's been turned on its head. Instead of that bubbling up, we have the administrative state that is pushing things down. And as we go through in our book, it's doing this in a very alarming way. Much of it people aren't aware of. They think they have local control of schools. They think the redesign of the cities and this drive for urbanization, they think, well, I'm not really into shaping how the communities look, but I'm sure other people are. And I'm sure that this is locally driven. It's not. And I think the analogy I use is it's sort of a broken down classroom from a parent's perspective. If you think about a good functioning classroom, you have, say, 20, 30 students, 20, 30 sets of parents, and some of those parents some of them are holding two jobs, and they can't pay attention to what's going on in the classroom. Some may be sick or their parents are sick, and they can't pay attention to what's going on. But always, there are a set of activist parents in every classroom, like Erin, who are paying attention to what's going on in the classroom, paying attention to what children are being taught. And those parents are sort of carrying the torch of liberty for the other parents in the classroom. And that's what's going on. And that was sort of, I think, what the founders envisioned for American society and government. But now it's broken. People are thinking, oh yes, someone else is doing that on this subject. But they're not. The administrative state has affected that profound shift. In subject area after subject area after subject area, it's not. It's not being done.
Well, and I think that's very interesting. So Tom, when did it change? Where did we go wrong? Was there a pivot point in American history where this started to change? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's happened gradually. For example, in education, we didn't lose education overnight. The left has been working incrementally at transforming education into an anti-American instrument for 100 years. We talked about trading liberty for security. Well, how did that happen? Why did the American people who embraced liberty and ratifying the Constitution begin slowly, seriatim, through a number of acts and resolutions, et cetera, and actions to give that up? It's because we lost knowledge of and faith in our founding principles. I don't blame the American people for that. I blame our universities, which for the last 50 years have abdicated responsibility for teaching our principles. And by that simply I mean this. I mean, what makes the American form of government truly exceptional in the sense in which American exceptionalism was always meant and not as it was distorted in the past 8 years? To be an American doesn't mean that you have to look any particular way or practice any particular religion. What it means, you don't have to come from any particular place or not. What it means is that you understand and you embrace the theory of justice as embodied in the Declaration of Independence. We can't understand the Constitution without understanding the Declaration. The Declaration's theory of justice consists of 4 self-evident truths: human equality, inalienable rights, government by consent, and the right to rebel. Now, by self-evident truths, they meant absolute truths. And this is where we started to fall down. We today are taught in the universities, and we hear from our elites, that the best way to promote a tolerant society is to not believe in any absolute truths. That way there will be a toleration for everyone, and no one will be suppressing anyone else's rights. The founders, by way of contrast, said there can be no tolerant, open, free society if it's not based on absolute truths. Right? So the role that moral and cultural relativism have played in the last century in causing Americans not to believe that their principles are any better than anybody else's, this, I think, was the pivotal turn.
That's fascinating. I'm going to direct the next question to Erin. And you guys went through great lengths in your book to detail these mechanisms, and where you go into the grants. I mean, I think that seems to be the main mechanism that they've been doing. But I think one of the most interesting aspects that you guys covered that I don't think a lot of people realize or know about is how the federal government uses these research grants. I think it's around $150 billion a year, to drive public policy and drive the narrative. Can you speak a little to that?
Sure. You know, talking about education, progressive education methods that schools use in lieu of the more effective methods that we have available are, I mean, the reason they think that's the best idea is because there's a lot of federal research grants that go to universities, go to your state education agency, go to your local education agency, even sometimes go directly to your schools, that require, as a condition of that grant, for the schools to use them, right? So particularly like the National Science Foundation, they are the supplier, using federal tax money, of most of the education research that directs what your children are learning and what your teachers in schools of ed, how they're being instructed to teach. But you know, federal agencies, they don't only use research to change policies, they also use this federal research to originate and advance new policies. The framers intended that the legislature would reflect the will of the people, right? That it's supposed to come from the people up and not be imposed from the state on high. But when federal researchers use their research as a tool by which issues are identified for congressional action, and also which policy prescriptions should be legislated to resolve them, it violates that principle. But progressives, they don't see this as a conflict because they believe that science, rather than the values of the people as reflected through their representatives or the rule of law or even the Constitution, should be determining public policy. For them, it's sort of like wherever and whatever the research leads to, that represents what is right or wrong for society and should dictate how we live our lives. And I'm not arguing that there's not a place for researchers at the policy table. It's just that in order for our constitutional structure to survive, they can't be the only one. And that's increasingly how it has become. And, you know, but after all, really research and expertise, those are contested domains in a democracy. But progressives would have you believe that the research they're conducting is this groundbreaking, innovative work that is being conducted solely in the name of science, and that it's going to render an objective and neutral determination. And maybe some of it is if you get beyond the social sciences and into the hard science research. But in most cases, federally funded research amounts to nothing more than push papers that are intended to spark a policy shift. And as we discuss in our book, agencies have used the federal research apparatus, which is huge, about $150 billion every single year. They use it to expand the scope of government, justify the scope of government. If you think about it, when federal researchers go to investigate or identify a problem, they never come back with a recommendation that, hey, you know what, we've looked at this, and I think really the problem lies outside the scope of government, and perhaps it would be better, handled by the private sector. I mean, if you find federal research that says that, I'd love to see it, because I'll tell you, it doesn't exist. But federal research, it habitually reaches the same conclusion. They take our tax dollars, they do research, and they come back with the same conclusion. It's that the current system is failing, systemic changes are needed, and the federal government has got to take action in order to resolve it. And since we're talking about education, I might mention that, a lot of people in the room might be familiar with the report. It's called A Nation at Risk. Yeah? So most people think that Reagan was behind that report. And if you're not familiar with the report, it essentially said that the state of education in America was, it painted a very bleak picture of that. I think it was like it was eroding the rising tide of mediocrity, and it was threatening the future, actually, of our country. Our education system was. But what people aren't aware of is that it was actually his first Secretary of Education, Terrence Bell, who actually commissioned that report. Reagan didn't want to, because he wanted to close down the department. But right? So here he has the Secretary of Education, Terrell Bell, who actually had helped Carter create the department just a year earlier. So he actually has a memoir, Terrell Bell. I'm sure I'm the only one nerdy enough in the room to have actually read it. And I actually wish I had it. It was pretty boring. But it did outline sort of why they commissioned A Nation at Risk. It was basically to supply those who supported a larger role in government with an evidence base that would prevent Reagan from closing the Department of Education. And in his book, he writes something like that he was elated by the hard-hitting, tone of the report, because it was literally giving them exactly what they needed to close the Department of Education. And I might close by saying that if those reports and this research just sat on a shelf in some bureaucrat's office and collected dust, the only harm of this research would be that it's a waste of taxpayer money. But it doesn't. It drives policy, and a lot of times it serves as a foundational document on which other research is built. And there's some research being done at the Cato Institute about this sort of bias within federal research and how it gets repeated in other forms of research, and they call it sort of a cascading bias amplification. And over time, this amplification of the biases in one report starts to create a national narrative, right? And this biased research becomes ultimately public opinion. So, and public opinion then, right, influences your state legislatures as well as Congress to drive policies and to pass legislation that really isn't something the public supports, right? It's something that researchers and federal agencies have created as an issue. I think I'll end there.
Personally, I think one of the most fascinating things is just the difference in how each state has responded to the federal government. I'm from the People's Republic of Illinois, and it seems like they can't get their hands on enough federal programs. But I think Texas has responded a little bit differently. So Tom, you're the resident on the panel that's an expert about Texas. They've arguably held on to our founding principles probably the best and most successfully. Have you seen much of this federal overreach coming to Texas? Are there ways that you guys have fought against it that you can detail? And then have you fallen short in some regards?
Well, yes, to all those questions. We have done some things and we have fallen short. I mean, look at, since the meltdown in 2007, I think it was roughly half the new jobs that were created in the country from that time to now came from Texas. I myself moved from Chicago to Texas. Now, the question is, why did that happen? It happened because Texas, following the principles on which our nation was founded, has lower taxes, it has limited government, it has common sense regulations. Businesses are attracted to that. They come to Texas, that creates jobs. People looking for jobs move to Texas. I mean, it's really very simple, the power of freedom, right? And we see what we have called here, and I think rightly so, the Texas miracle. Now, having said that, Texas is a part of this country, and we are affected by the bad doctrines that we've heard about this morning. One item in particular that I've been fighting for the last 2 legislative sessions, I tried to get a bill passed 2 years ago and then this session. All it would have done would have been to have made transparent to the Texas legislature how much money is going from the federal government straight to cities and counties and local governments in Texas, right? Now, originally the bill said, if you get this money from the federal government, you've got to report it to the governor and the Attorney General and the Legislative Budget Board, and they've got to decide whether that's good for Texas. And if it's not, you've got to give the money back. That went nowhere, so we changed it to simply transparency. Can the legislature please just know what you're getting? No, we couldn't get that passed either.
Wow.
Wow.
So, a very strange source here explaining this. We wouldn't think that anything in Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in the 2012 case, NFIB versus Sebelius, we wouldn't think there was anything in there good for us, but in fact there was. And Erin made reference to it. In that opinion, Chief Justice Roberts says this, in the very act of upholding Obamacare. He says, states are independent and sovereign entities. Sometimes they have to act like it. In other words, he was saying, folks, I can't help you, but you've got the power under the Constitution. Resist. Right? That's what's required.
I think that's true, and we cite that in our book. However, I think there's 2 things we should realize. Part of the Texas miracle is relative. It's better in Texas than it is elsewhere in the country, and you know, America is still a better country than most every other country. So it's relative. The administrative state is still pounding away in Texas. And I think for Justice Roberts to say that, yes, it's a good statement, but I think it's really only a half statement. When you look at what the federal government has done to the constitutional structure with the aid of the Supreme Court, Justice Roberts is talking about state decision making. The federal government, the administrative state, has broken the state decision making process. It's broken. So, and it's broken by the federal government. So it's wrong for the federal government to say, well, why aren't you acting like a state? Well, we're not acting like a state because you broke our mechanism. That's the real problem here. And I think we get into this in our book. We're not going to solve this until we realize this, and we have to start pounding away at the real culprit, the biggest culprit, which is Congress. And I think if you look at the great, powerful reform movements in history, there's the Reformation, there's the American cause of independence. It starts with that claim of that list of grievances. And it's a list of grievances that's delivered to the most responsible party. And maybe that responsible party isn't going to do anything. But you know what it does? It sharpens the debate, it raises the consciousness of the people, and it raises the issue up. So if you ask Congress, if you ask leaders, if you sat them down and say, well, are you defending the constitutional structure? They say, well, yeah, well, we're doing the best we can in the circumstances, the political circumstances we have. We're really trying. But no, they're not. They should be driving this. They should be making floor statements. They should be publishing op-eds.
Yeah.
They should be demanding that reform legislation get through. And yes, state officials and state activists should also be demanding that. And governors should be sending letters, and other state elected officials should be sending letters to leadership in Congress saying, you've broken our system. You need to fix it. It's your fault. It's primarily your fault. You need to fix it. And that part isn't being done. And it's being done in some respects. There are, Attorney General Paxton is doing a great job. But I'm talking about a larger movement. I mean, liberty is in peril. The American experiment is in danger.
Tom?
Yeah, I think that's very good. I just want to add a point to that. Look, in democracy, you get the government you deserve. So for example, we complain often. You'll hear congressmen complain, oh, the Supreme Court's taken our power. The executive branch, the administrative branch has taken our power. No, they didn't. You gave it to them, right? Under our Constitution, the Congress is the most powerful of the three branches because it's closest to the people. It's the most powerful because we're a democracy. It was given in exchange for the promise of security, for the promise of money. Roberts, in his Sebelius decision, says you have to refuse the federal blandishments, right? Well, that's, as we see, very hard to do. So just as in the case where Supreme Court didn't take powers from Congress, Congress gave it to them, and they love it, by the way. They love it. Why? Because now they can say, well, I'm pro-life, but Supreme Court, what can I do? Right? In 1989, in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision by the Supreme Court, a lot of so-called pro-life politicians were going crazy because now suddenly they were going to have to lead. Right? Much easier to just put it off on somebody else. And in the same manner, yes, the state's power today is broken, but it wasn't broken against its will. It sold itself out, right? Why? Because we lost, and that's why just about everything we're talking about here is ultimately related to civic education. Jefferson said, popular jealousy. The people have to be jealous of their liberty and resist what Roberts calls the federal blandishments. Right? That's what we have to reinstate.
Terry and I, we met with a senator a couple weeks ago, and he was sort of beside himself, and he was saying, the leadership is, they don't want any defeats. Well, if that's your strategy, you don't want any defeats, that means you're afraid to fight the good fight.
Right.
So this is dysfunction, but we need that. We need that statement of grievances. With the revolution, we had that statement. That process was done essentially, I think, from January 10th with the publication of Common Sense through July 4th, 1776. So it was a series of statements and a series of list of problems to the king that this needed to be changed. And then that galvanized the people. The people changed from being, well, we hope Parliament will fix things, we hope the king will fix things. It changed them. It galvanized the movement, and it delivered victory. And that's what we need to do right now, and that's the next step.
Well, we're going to get to Q&A in just a second, but I want Erin to talk about something real quick. She's a very humble person, so she's not going to brag, but she is like your all-star. She is really like an all-star citizen activist. I mean, she's had to deal with these politicians for at least like the past 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, it's been a real joy.
Emmett just detailed that the system's broken. It's broken at Congress, it's broken at the state level. Can you talk to, it just seems across the board that these politicians at the state level and in Congress aren't willing to fight.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is in your experience? I mean, you deal with them. Why?
Well, I mean, a lot of times when I talk to members of Congress, particularly about education law, they'll say, you know, we just reauthorized No Child Left Behind in end of 2015, and it really was no better than No Child Left Behind. It just sort of disguised the problems better, right? It just used better language so that people in Congress said, oh, that's great, you know, you're getting rid of AYP, I'll vote for it. But what they didn't know, there's a bunch of bad stuff that's actually worse than the good things that were in the bill. So when I push back on that, and they'll say, well, look, we're not hearing from the states in general. What we do hear is that they like this, that this is working for them. But when they say they aren't hearing from the states, or when they actually say they are talking to the states, they're not talking about your state legislators. They're not talking about your governor, and they're not talking about the people. What they're talking about are the people who work within state agencies. Well, I'm sure the state education agency says, yeah, this is great. Because, you know, in all their federal grants that they get what I call is like a broker's fee, right? So they get like a 3% cut on the grants that stays within the administration of that agency. And this is how they grow their agency, this is how they hire more people, and this is how they become more powerful in the state. But I would also say that, you know, a lot of times they're not pushing back because there really isn't a constituency with deep enough pockets or an army on K Street that actually wants to get that done, right? What we want as a state, there really isn't anybody advocating for that to members of Congress. And I think it's because we've seen this blurring of the line between left and right. Yet it used to be just progressives who were petitioning Congress to pass these big government programs, right? Big social service, big government programs. That was sort of the thing on the left. And on the right, we had, you know, the business interests, right? The business community and conservatives who were wanting limited government. But what we see is that the business community is not always on the side of limited government anymore. They want big government programs. They want the regulations. They want, you know, these burdens that generally fall to the state in the form of higher taxes and compliance for small businesses. So it's sort of like that business component that used to be fighting and urging our Congress members to take action, to put forward ideas that support limited government are gone. I mean, Texas is better in everything than any other state, and maybe your Chamber of Commerce is equally better than in some of the other states, but they are fighting in state after state for some of the most progressive programs. I'm telling you, I can't tell the difference between the Chamber of Commerce and labor unions or whatever. I mean, there's very little difference, and it's hard because they're the ones that should be motivating our, you know, conservative leaders in Congress to do what we want them to do, and they're just not doing that.
Right. Tom?
Well, I think that's an excellent point that Erin raises here. You know, conservatism is too often identified as pro-business. We're not pro-business, we're pro-free markets.
Right.
Business is not necessarily free markets. Business is what will increase my profit in the next quarter.
Right.
And if marrying government is the way you do it, then you do it, right? So really the task, I mean, you think of it, big business, big government are like anxious lovers, right? The job of conservatism is keep them apart.
Right.
Because business sells its opportunity to innovate and all the freedom that entrepreneurs require, it sells that to government for, again, the promise of security. You won't have to compete. Oh, I won't have to compete? Great. Right? And we see the consequences.
I might just add, you know, like all these targeted federal subsidies for businesses, for like economic growth and all these other things, they might be better. So if you're going to tax, I think I heard this said something like, if you're going to tax Peter and Paul to give Mary a subsidy, well, Mary's going to do better, right? But the rest of us are not, because, you know, the benefits are narrow and they accrue to a very small percent of the population. Anyway.
All right, well, I think we should open up for questions, and I think we'll start right here because you're the first one I saw.
Yeah. First, a kidding comment. There's a reason we refer to the Congress and the Republican leadership as spineless eunuchs. I mean, it is a disgrace to watch them. Is this still working?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to make a point is that that's the question. We had John Cornyn here, as spineless a eunuch as there is in Washington, at a lunch, and he was griping about the EPA. He gave a great conservative speech. It was wonderful. And he griped about the EPA, and so I asked the question. I said, well, John, why don't we do something, you're talking about the symptom, why don't we do about the problem, something called civil service? You know, if you would change some of the personnel laws in Washington, you could fire some of the people you're complaining about. He's got this look on his face like, what the heck are you talking about? So afterwards, I walked up and we chatted for a minute, and we talked about that subject, and it was like talking to a guy who had a second-grade education. I mean, it was embarrassing. He had no concept of the fact you got to fire some bureaucrats to get their attention. You know, and so coming back to it, who in Washington is at least doing it? Clearly no one in the Republican leadership in Congress is doing it. President Trump, with his pluses and minuses, obviously pluses dramatically more, I see him doing some of it, but is there anybody out there doing it? I mean, it's great to talk about it. None of you said anything I didn't 100% agree with, but who do we shoot out there to send a message to the rest of them?
Erin, do you want to take that?
Well, you know, I think there are people in Congress who want to do it, but leadership manages them in a way where they don't really get into positions of power, right? If you're a strict constitutionalist that believes in limited government, you're not going to be made the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. I guarantee you that.
That's an absolute guarantee.
Right. So one idea I have, and I seem to be the only one who likes it, but I'll throw it out here. I think that as far as when Congress or when leadership appoints people to committees and appoints chairmanships, I think it should be done in the way that they elect the speaker, that they should be voted on by the majority body as a whole versus appointed by leadership. I think, because you know, every legislator is supposed to be equal there. And the fact is that they're not. And it is the responsibility, or it is the fault of party leadership. And I think those committees and chairmanships has a lot to do with that. So that would be my suggestion, but I'm not getting Ryan to do that.
Norman?
I've had the advantage or disadvantage of first half of my 50-year career was in that swamp at all levels of government, local to international, mostly executive branch, but some elected office. And I too agree that you folks are right on it. You understand it and know what our problems are. I would like a focus on what we do about it. And my limited understanding is that the best thing going that we can do about it is Convention of States, which takes the federal government out of this decision-making process of what we do about it. And it has, in what is being proposed in the practice sessions of the Convention of States, a reduction of monopoly. And monopoly is one of our biggest problems. Yes. And I had my grandson, who's computer effective, to look up what the biggest monopoly in the United States is. It would not surprise you that by far it was the federal government of the United States. It wasn't the private sector. I've had also the opportunity, the last half of my career, to work in the private sector with the justice system as a professional engineer, expert witness. And that too has verified what you say today. And it's pointed out how important it is to have effective ways to solve this problem and to turn this trend around that's been with us, like you said, for 100 years.
I can respond to that.
Yeah.
No, Norman, I think your points are wonderful. The Convention of States is the only constitutional remedy to the problems that we're here to discuss today. Our founders foresaw what happened in 1787 at the Philadelphia Convention. They were just about done with the Constitution, and at that time, only Congress, it would take 2/3 of Congress to propose a constitutional amendment, 3/4 of the states to ratify it. And then George Mason, delegate from Virginia, said, wait a second here. You're telling me that if Congress takes on too much power, then under this provision, they're going to institute amendments to reduce the power that they themselves took? Right? And even Alexander Hamilton saw the merits. And so that's how we got the second provision, that 2/3 of the states can propose a constitutional amendment. And that's all thanks to George Mason. That's how you get a university named after you, right? Right? And look, we've never had we're talking 34 states have to file with Congress. Now, we've got 14 right now that have approved Convention of State resolutions. We've never gotten to the 2/3, but you don't have to win. Because back at the beginning of the last century, the states were one state away from approving a convention of states to propose direct election of U.S. senators. And the Congress said, oh my goodness, the states are only one state away. We can't let them exercise their powers. So quickly Congress proposed it and it was done. Right? So you don't have to win. Right?
Well, so, and there was a second example in the 80s. There was a push for a balanced budget amendment, and a couple states away, and then Congress passed the Graham-Rudman-Hollins Act. But I think there's a few other points that need to be made. First, I think the next step really is we have to pound on Congress with a list of grievances and a statement that this is their fault. And it's all these policy things, it's these mechanisms they use, it's their committee selection process. They also tie the committee selection process and leadership process to political fundraising. Which of course invites the special interests.
It should be illegal, in my opinion.
Yeah, and so there's all this statement of grievances has to be done, and state officials need to start doing it. They need to start doing it through lawsuits, like your Attorney General is doing a great job of that, but also through op-eds, resolutions, letters to Congress, and citizen activists. And it's important, I think, as I said before, it focuses the issue and identifies the culprit. And if you look at the history of reforms, if that's not done, the reform process tends to meander and disintegrate and maybe dead end, or it can go off into really radical directions. So that's what's important. Now you look at the Convention of the States. As Madison said, well, there's a lot that's unknown about this, and it is, as Tom said, it was meant to be provide a second avenue, so the power doesn't rest with Congress. There's a big issue as to whether or not, and it's unsolvable here. You can make a strong argument one way or the other. There's a big issue as to whether or not the subject matter of the conventions can be limited. And a lot of there's 3 or 4 different movements to have a convention going on, but most of them, maybe all of them, try to limit the subject matter of the conventions. But it's unknown whether that can be done. And it's also unknown, well, who's the decider of that? Maybe it's the Supreme Court, I suppose. But put that aside, so say you get a set of proposals, amendments, and what's the next step? The next step is it goes to Congress. And so say some of those amendments exceed the limited application for a convention and get into, say, something like gun rights or something. Well, the next step is for Congress, and Congress has to decide, is the ratification process going to be by state legislature or by convention. There's a convention process on the back end, and that option is up to Congress. So if these set of amendments come to Congress, what's Congress to do? I think since the idea is they're not supposed to have a role in it, they would probably just send it through the ratification process.
They don't have that role.
Yeah, but they have to send it, they have to decide on the ratification process. So they'll send it on, and bear in mind, 27 of 33 amendments that have been proposed have passed. So it is possible that it can go into, the opponents of a convention say, well, you could have a runaway convention. That's possible. And it's not entirely reliable that the check will be effective in the states. So that's just one thing to consider. On the other end of it, as a Heritage has pointed out, it could also end up, because so much is undecided about the particulars of how the conventions operate and who funds it and the selection of delegates by the states, it could also end up in sort of a dead-end process.
Emmett, I just want to keep it, we're almost running out of time.
Okay, well, let me just finish. But
Tied up in the court.
yeah, and it could get tied up in the courts. So I think those things have to be balanced. But I think I think we're just the next step though is this demand on Congress. Either way.
Yeah.
Tom, go ahead.
I stand with Justice Scalia on this. He discussed the effects of a convention of states in 1979 when the balanced budget amendment was being considered. And Justice Scalia said, I don't really care what the first amendment that 2/3 of the states propose is. And now he said, of course, I don't want something silly, but he said, if you finally get, for the first time in American history, 3/4 of the state, or 2/3 of the states to agree on something, imagine all the coalitions between states, among states, within states, the education of the American people that would have to take place in order for this to happen. And what Scalia said was, he said, you do that. He said, and you watch the Supreme Court and Congress sit up and take notice, right? Because they'll recognize we've had what Lincoln calls a return to first principles. And then the last point about a runaway convention, let's say we go in to restrict the size of government and it comes out with no Second Amendment. Just, right? The horror story. It takes 3/4 of the states, right? Remember, they're the ones who sent the original ones in. That means 13 states can block any amendment. Now, if there aren't 13 states left in the Union that love liberty, then our experiment in government's over already.
Wiped out the opposition, and that's it.
You had a question.
Wouldn't it be great, I ask you, wouldn't it be great if Texas didn't have to wait on an Article 5 convention a dozen years or more, 37 other states, to allow us to act as a sovereign state we are and enforce the Constitution? Wouldn't that be great?
Amazing.
Because I agree that the Supreme Court did not steal our powers, we gave it to them, but I disagree that the ultimate villain in this is Congress. The founders knew that when the federal government exceeded its authority, they thought and assumed that the states, jealously guarding their own sovereign rights that had been reserved under the 10th Amendment, would stand up and say no more. So I blame the states. I blame the state of Texas as the sovereign leader that we are for not acting. I blame our leaders from the governor on down for not leading this charge. So if you think it'd be great if we could do that, I'm telling you, it's here. We have every single thing we need right here, right now, to enforce the Constitution against a federal bully. And we lack only one thing, and it's the thing we have the most control over. It's our mindset. It's the will to do it, and that takes leadership.
No, I think that's great. Yeah.
Sorry, ma'am.
The gentleman up here in the front with the dark jacket.
In 1947, the U.S. Code was modified Title IV, Chapter 3, subsection 72, Rule 72. There's currently an initiative at foot to repeal this Rule 72, and I might suggest that it may well be a fairly strong starting point, or at least a point to pursue. It's a simple one-line rule. It reads, all offices attached to the seat of government shall be executed or exercised in the District of Columbia and not elsewhere except as otherwise expressly provided by law. I think that decentralizing the federal government by spreading the departments around the country, two examples would be to put the GSA in San Antonio and the Department of Energy in Houston, along with Bureau of Indian Affairs in Oklahoma City, and the list goes on. But to decentralize the federal government by repealing Rule 72 to begin with, and then set about dispersing these agencies in the federal government, breaking up the cabal, the centralization of power in Washington, D.C. in terms of lobbyist one-stop shop. Okay?
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I would say just really quickly on that, I think that it used to make a difference, you know, geographic separation, distance between things made things harder, but today, with the data collection the way that it is, if you want to know how agencies, what gives them their power, what gives them their ability to, through the rulemaking process and other things, to actually create law, it's the data. So like your state longitudinal databases, everybody thinks it's going to be so great because, you know, we can make these decisions so much better because we'll be able to pull data from what data that used to reside, say, within the State Department of Education. You had data that sat and resided in the silo of your, you know, Labor Department, Criminal Justice Department. Well, now they can pull all this data together, and everybody thinks it's going to be so wonderful for state decision making. But what they don't understand is, like, you know that expression, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world? Well, now that expression is going to be really the hand that holds the data will rule the world. Yeah. Because you can cherry pick that data to the point where you can make data say anything that you want. Yes. So when they talk about how it's going to have all this cost savings and better decision making for your state, it's not. Those huge data collection bases are really about giving up your decision making process to a bureaucrat. I mean, do you know I was at the ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and I went to this seminar about bail bonds. The bail bonds group had put it on. And there's essentially an algorithm. So if you're going up for bond and the judge is trying to decide whether or not you get bond, or let's say whether or not you get out of jail, they take some data from you, they put it into a system, and there's an algorithm that looks at all the data, and it renders a decision, and it says, like, yes, give him bail. No, don't let him out. And the thing is that these algorithms that they compile the data with are proprietary. So you don't even know what they're doing. And we see this in education too, like blended learning, digital learning. It's going to be tailored and personalized just for you, little Johnny. Well, the algorithm's deciding what Johnny learns. No one can see it. Not even his own teacher, not your state board of ed, nobody. So that's just my plug against digital learning and data
I would just
collection.
make a quick comment on that. I used to be a proponent of spreading the federal government around the country. Now, it gives me pause after studying the land issue in some states. Like Utah, for instance, the federal government owns 85% of the land. There could be a problem with this. I mean, in many states, you could put a federal agency in that state, and then that federal agency, with all the bureaucrats, is suddenly the biggest employer, the biggest social group,
And voters.
and voters.
Yes.
And it gives me pause as to how that would manipulate. I think the founders had a certain wisdom in putting everything in Washington. They didn't want it to be big.
47 among the founders.
And guys, I just want to say we've actually run out of time. General Pax will be here any minute, but all the people will be here around throughout the day. You'll be able to ask them questions. Let's give them a round of applause. I think they did a great job.